Hi, I'm Kim Kleinman, and I'm here to interview Adrienne Harris for the ISPA website. We're about to have a conference in July on the feminine, and I'm going to talk with Dr. Harris about her involvement with that subject throughout her career. Adrienne Harris is a member of the postdoctoral program at NYU and the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. She's editor of Psychoanalytic Dialogues and Studies in Gender and Sexuality. Her recent publications are Gender and Soft Assembly, First Do No Harm, The Paradoxical Encounters in Psychoanalysis, War Making and Resistance, co-edited with Stephen Botticelli. Dr. Harris is widely published on topics of gender and development, analytic subjectivity, self-care, primitive states, the legacy of Sandor Ferenczi, and the effects of World War I on the psychoanalytic community.
Thanks, Kim.
So I'd like you to just start with your reaction to the idea of the conference on the feminine and what your ideas are about that.
Well, I think for a lot of people who've worked on all the ways in which gender and sexuality are so complex, the idea of the feminine was like, oh, what's this going to be about? And on the one hand, it feels like, yes, let's do that, because we so often talk about the masculine as though that's the generic form. But I think what's been interesting is that there's a great deal of interest in this Congress, that something of that topic has set off all kinds of interest across a lot of different communities. And I'm part of a group of colleagues, and we're doing a pre-conference on models of gender and sexuality. And there are already 60 people enrolled in it. And it just feels like this is a moment and this is a topic with great complexity, filled with contradictions, filled with suffering, filled with many, many interesting vicissitudes. And I think maybe we're, as a community or communities, really ready to take this up. So, for example, I edited a relational book series. We've just finished an international book on psychoanalysis, society, and the law, in which all these different people from an IPA committee on psychoanalysis and the law are writing about all kinds of social problems, caste, from an Indian perspective, murder of women, abortion rights, trafficking, gender dysphoria, transgender. So it feels like across many analytic communities, this is an important topic, and it's really a timely one to think. And I think that it's very political. It's bound to be. There's bound to be a lot of conflict. I don't know how you could have this topic and not have that. And so I think the hope is that the mood at the Congress will be one of interest and attempting to learn from each other what feels impossible, what feels necessary. So when I thought about, our interview and our talking, I thought when I think about gender and sexuality and these kinds of identities, I feel we're in a moment that is so contradictory, in which these categories are so fixed, so potent. We could be including race and femininity and all of these. These categories seem just ironclad, and they seem very fluid. And I think both things are true, that there is male and female do have these absolutely generic, existential, biological phenomena attached to them. There's procreative sex, what happens, who can have a baby, and in what way. And it's not that that's always, it's also, there's changing, there are reproductive technologies, there are many, many things that are changing, but there's also fixity. And I think the culture can be very brutal in its demands on people to conform to gender.
Mhm.
I think that actually trans people are finding that transition may be to a more humane feeling, natural feeling body, but it isn't to a body that isn't subject to the state, subject to culture, subject to conflict.
Mhm.
So I think we have a situation of enormous complexity where things can be very fixed and very demanding and very fluid.
Mhm.
And I'm very influenced at the moment. I was trained in America and in the relational group, very influenced by the French writer Jean Laplanche. And he talks about, you can think about sex, gender, and the sexual. So
Mhm.
for him, what he means by sex is what we would mean by sex differences, male, female.
Mhm.
Gender, he feels, is something that is assigned. Gender is a conviction. It isn't something built in. It's sort of a message from the other and the state. And then there's sexuality, or the sexual, in which enormously how any child becomes libidinized and where gender fits into that is so utterly unpredictable.
Right.
It's why, for me, nonlinear dynamic systems is such an important
Mhm.
model, that it's a model of nonlinearity, of emergence. Something comes unpredictably out of all these subtle transactions.
So what do you think of the idea of separating the idea of gender and the feminine, as that they're
I
not?
don't think much of the idea, but in general, I like ideas to mix. I don't, I want, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to take the feminine and isolate it as it's some idealized situation separate from a million other factors.
Mm.
You know, you and I were talking before about what happens if you grow up and you're a tomboy.
Mhm.
What happens if that's your assigned? No, that's not separate from masculinity, and gender are very implicated, and yet it's more complicated than just being a boy.
Mhm.
But I have this example that I'm always sort of using, a patient describing in his middle age, remembering his father saying to him when he was very young, sort of 12, 13, "We have to teach you to walk like a boy." And he just felt so ashamed, so utterly, as though his feminine self was just this absolutely horrifying
Mhm.
shame to the father. And, you know, we can say lots about, well, who was ashamed and who was anxious, the father or the son? Who was in trouble here? And, you know, as the patient and I began to talk about this, it was clear that the immediate aftermath of that event was a terrible one, and that he had a very serious accident that we came to feel had some element of a passive suicide attempt.
Mm.
And that there was something about, if he was going to fail at gender
Mhm.
because he was too feminine, how
Mhm.
could he live?
Mhm.
So I think we can't underestimate the amount of danger that any fluidity of gender can set off for somebody. And at
Right.
the same time, one is the product of all these complicated transactions. And here I'm very much speaking as a relational person. I'm interested in how things are co-constructed. How
Mhm.
something like one's gender and one's feeling about one's body
Mhm.
is a co-construction from multiple
Mm.
dynamics and multiple
Mhm.
conversations. So I guess I don't want to isolate the feminine.
Right, right. So in that example that you give, the idea of feminine is something to be repudiated.
Yeah, it's in the wrong body. It's in the wrong kind of person. And
Right.
it's dangerous. And I think we communicate enormous amount to each other about what it's okay to be.
Mhm.
You know, how tomboy can you be? You know, how gay can you be? How black can you be? We're on saying all kinds of subtle communications that really are like enforcement. I mean, I think the term,
Identity police, gender police. Yeah.
Totally. The gender police and the race police and all the various police. I mean, the term for it, I think, rightly comes from political theory of the notion of interpolation.
Mm-hmm.
The state and the culture and the family interpolate somebody.
Yeah.
They say, hey, you, and then you are cast as this kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to make space for the feminine, the masculine, the unbinaried.
For the individual expression of something that starts out as a binary.
I think that in the notion of the feminine, there's something it's not. It is something and it is not something else. So it starts to speak to and for the masculine.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a wonderful experience listening to Bob Gallitzer-Levy, who's a psychoanalyst in Chicago, talk about, he has these mathematical models, and he talks about the notion of what is called a fractal. And a fractal is a kind of a substance with very sharp, strict boundaries. It's a whole mathematical object.
Mm-hmm.
So a snowflake has fractal organizations. But what Gallitzer-Levy says is, but you get closer and closer to the fractal, you get more and more into, and the closer you get to it, the more complex it becomes, the less sharp the boundaries are, and something that seems at one glance utterly ironclad is actually all uncertain and muddled. So I think if we could think about identity like gender, like sexuality, as much more fluid, much more with boundaries that are not so marked. Inevitably, they may become so, but they're more complicated. And so I love his model of the fractal so what would a fractal feminine look like?
Oh, it's great. I think that's a great place to end.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I hope we're going to look forward to a wonderful meeting in the IPA in London in July. I think it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, it should be great.